Thank you everyone for coming this evening. I want to thank Joe and the museum for hosting this series. When Joe first approached me a few months ago about doing a presentation on this topic, I really jumped at the chance. I was, quite a comic book consumer in my youth, and I can't be said to be a collector because I didn't treat my comics very well, and I pulled a bunch out of a box, but I did keep them, and I went through them a few nights ago to see how many radiation-themed superheroes I might be able to find. I found a few, but not a whole lot, but I had a lot of fun doing the research on this lecture tonight, and I found that there are literally more than dozens. There are probably hundreds of characters, both superheroes and villains, that have been inspired in some way or another by the radiation or nuclear theme. And so really touching on a fairly small sample tonight as a vehicle to talk to you about ionizing radiation in general, what it is, and the actual effects on the body. A little bit of background up front. You heard Joe said I have a master's degree in anthropology and actually an emphasis in archaeology. So how did an archaeologist end up running an offsite radiological monitoring program? A little bit of a backstory. I got my degree from Texas Tech and was getting close to completing my master's and applied to several different places, and Desert Research Institute was one of them. I hadn't heard back, and I gave them a call and said, yeah, the position's still open, we want to fly you out for an interview. And I came out in 1991 and got the job, and I called up my mom. I was so excited because the joke in my family was, if the archaeology doesn't work out for you, you've got your music to fall back on. So that's kind of the place I was in. Both worked out pretty well for me, actually. But I remember calling my mom to tell her that that I'd gotten a job doing archaeology. I'd be based out of Las Vegas. She wasn't sure what to think about that right away, but that I'd be working on this program called the Yucca Mountain Program out on a place called the Nevada Test Site. And there was a big pause on the other end of the line. She says, don't you know what that is? And I had no idea what it was actually at the time. And so that's where they blew up all the atomic bombs and did all the testing, and you're going to get cancer. And I started to get pretty freaked out about it. And my very first month on the job as an archaeologist, well, first of all, I should say I came back to the search committee and I said, what about this radiation issue? Do I need to be worried? And they said, well, you'll be working on the test site, but you're about as far from where they actually did the testing as you could be and still be on the test site, which was true. Yucca Mountain is kind of in the southwest corner of the test site. What I didn't know is that there had been another nuclear program in that particular area, a nuclear rocket development program. And my very first month on the job, I was doing a survey with a bunch of archaeologists, and we were coming up to what I thought was kind of a weird-looking installation up on the terrace. We were walking the bottom of the wash looking for archaeological materials because we knew that the geologists were going to follow after us in ATVs and possibly disturb some archaeological sites. And so archaeology is one of the environmental surveys that is required to be done in advance of a lot of these activities. And so I remember we were coming up to this installation, and there was this concrete berm built across the wash with some railroad tracks that came into it, and big steel door kind of hanging off its hinges in this concrete berm. And there was a single strand of wire that wasn't even quite continuous. No signs that we saw, and we passed over this concrete berm and down the other side. And I remember all of a sudden one of the archaeologists over on my left-hand side said, uh-oh, which is one of the top phrases you don't want to hear when you're at a nuclear test site, uh-oh, and he's picked up a metal sign that at the time was lying face down on the ground that said, danger, radiation area, keep out. And so I'd been on the job about a month, and I got pretty freaked out, and of course they gave us what are called whole body scans and went out and checked out the area. We were fine, but this was an area where they had tested some of the nuclear rockets, and they had allowed as one of the tests, one of the reactors essentially to go critical and blow up on the pad. And so there were little things lying here and there. But from that time on, I always wondered, what had I been exposed to? What did I need to worry about? And so when the chance came up to be involved in this community environmental monitoring program, I jumped at the chance for a couple of reasons. Number one, Yucca Mountain was kind of starting to wind down its characterization phase. Number two, I wanted to self-educate myself about radioactivity, and this program represented a way for me to do that, a very large public outreach component that goes out into the communities, talks to people about what we know about ionizing radiation, what do we actually know about health effects, what's the mythology, the history of the test site, and that sort of thing. And I'm a big proponent of anything that brings science to the public in an understandable form. So that's how an archaeologist got involved in the radiation monitoring field. It's been a wonderful experience, and so I jumped at the chance to combine these two interests for this lecture. I want to make this kind of informal. I don't want to wait till the end to take questions, so if you have a question along the way, please raise your hand. I might defer it to my health physicist, depending on the technical level of the question, but I want there to be a lot of interaction, and I hope you'll have some fun as we go along here. So I want to talk about several superheroes right up front here that you'll hear later on in the program. Steve will address their various abilities and supposedly how they got their abilities in more detail. But we're going to start out with a little quiz for you to see if you know your superheroes. And 3 of these 4, just about everyone better get. We've got some problems. See a show of hands, who knows who this is? Incredible Hulk. Right, Incredible Hulk. 1962 is the first time he appears. And what role did radiation play in his creation? If somebody knows this, raise your hand. Joe, you can't. Yes. You read it off there. Anybody know without reading it off the wall? Help us out.
Is this the one where his dad accidentally created it? Or no, that he's the fruit bearer. He's at a test site. Went nuclear and fizzled, and anyway, there's the whole.
He was working on creating a gamma bomb,
yes.
Basically. Creating a gamma bomb, and some guy in a jalopy came wandering out onto the test site, and he said, "Stop the test," and he went out and saved the guy, but for some reason the countdown didn't stop, and so he was exposed to what in the comic is called a nuclear explosion, which certainly probably did contain some gamma rays in it, but it wasn't certainly just a gamma ray bomb, and so, gamma bomb accident. One thing you'll notice about almost all of these superhero characters, that regardless of these amazing abilities that are conferred upon them by their interaction with radiation, it's almost always termed an accident of some kind that leads to the exposure of the radiation, which then gives them these wonderful abilities. So there's this kind of good and bad thing, which is really indicative of radioactivity in our world, right? We have a lot of beneficial uses and a lot of ways that can harm you, and we'll learn more about that as we go on this evening. Okay, next here. Spider-Man, of course. 1962 also. Been around a while. What role did radiation play in his creation? What was that? Spider, right? Bitten by a radioactive, and this is important, or irradiated spider. I've seen both descriptions in the literature. These are 2 very different things. Maybe Steve will, well, I'll just say, bit by a radioactive spider, it implies that the spider itself is radioactive. Irradiated spider means the spider has been exposed to some dose of radioactivity, but is not necessarily radioactive itself. And in fact, when we talk about irradiating food for safety, for example, that does not render the food radioactive. This is probably the hardest one, or the least. Fantastic Four, very good. 1961, so they've been around quite a while as well. And what role did radiation play in their creation? What's that? Change their body structure, but what was the accident or how were they exposed? Anybody know that story?
They were in space.
Yeah, they were.
Yep.
Anomaly.
They were in space, it was a space mission, and they were exposed to cosmic radiation. As are we all, as we will learn later on. So exposed to cosmic rays during a space mission. And this is something that actually has a concern in reality, and that they're talking about and have been talking about for a long time, about a potential manned mission to Mars. The amount of cosmic radiation that the astronauts will be exposed to on that voyage is considerable. So they're talking about ways to mitigate that.